I'm going to talk a bit about Interop 2022. And I kind of wanted to start by just saying it's really, really exciting at the moment to be a CSS developer and to be involved with CSS. There's a ton of stuff landing in browsers. We've just seen Cascade Layers land in all 3 browsers. There's, much more to come this year. There's a lot happening, and it's all landing in browsers in a much more robust and interoperable way than ever before. Now, interoperable, as well as being a word that's really hard to say on stage, it's important. It means that a feature works, and it works the same way across browsers. So you can use some CSS and test in Chrome and be confident if you open up Firefox or Safari, it's going to behave in the same way. Now, in the past, this was something you could not rely on. You couldn't rely on this at the most basic of levels, so how the width of a box was calculated. At one point, at a point where we essentially had 2 browsers, we had Internet Explorer and Netscape, and the 2 major players calculated the box model differently. Netscape used the standard box model as we know it today, so as if you were using box sizing content box, and Internet Explorer used the alternate box model as if you were using box sizing border box. But the box sizing property didn't exist, so you couldn't normalize the 2, other than via the box model hack, which is what I've got on screen there, which was created by Tantat Chelik, and we all kind of used to get around this problem. So, things are getting a lot better today. We don't have to do things like that. And I've been involved in sort of web standards and the web platform for a very long time. And interoperability, although we didn't tend to use that word, was what the Web Standards project that I was part of campaigned for back in the day. We wanted standard things to work in a standard way. And we pretty much have that today. And this is huge for web developers. It's so important. So things are a lot better. We don't have showstopper bugs such as a different box model in our browsers. And in general, browsers do implement standard features in a standard way. We do, of course, see bugs because browsers are software and software has bugs, and especially when dealing with something as complex as CSS. CSS is written by people who make mistakes. They might make mistakes in the CSS, or they might make mistakes in the underlying HTML, and then the browsers have to kind of error correct and figure out what to do. CSS needs to render content written in every possible language and script in different script directions and writing modes. It sometimes needs to render multiple languages on one page. CSS also still needs to allow those websites that were written 20 years ago to display in a reasonable manner in modern browsers. Now, this is not simple stuff. It's not surprising that we run up against bugs. But another thing that's changed today is that new browser versions come around really quickly. Firefox and Chrome are both now on a monthly release cycle. Safari is landing features in between major versions too. So we're getting all these new features, new browser versions all the time. Now, in between IE 6 and 7, and of course, we're celebrating the demise of Internet Explorer today, and it sort of, becoming end of life. But there was 5 years between releases of IE 6 and 7. So the web basically stopped because it was, a browser with all the market share, and it wasn't releasing any new features. These days, I write a monthly post on web.dev about new things on the web platform, and there's plenty of content that I can pick from every month. I don't have everything, I just have a selection, and there's plenty of content there. Now that would be unimaginable 10 years ago. So we're getting these new features more quickly than ever before, but each browser has its own priorities and what it's going to focus on, because browsers are businesses. And so with every feature that lands, every time a browser lands a brand new feature that's never been seen before on the web platform, we get a gap. We get a gap between the feature landing in the first browser and the others catching up. Now, often people will point the finger at one particular browser or another and say, oh, that one's been slow. But actually, when you look at it, it's fairly well spread out between browsers in terms of which browser is first and which is last. It just really depends on the priority. But in every survey of web developers, we hear that making sites and applications work well across browsers is the hardest thing. So even today, we've got quite a lot of interoperability between browsers. We're still hearing that. This slide is from the State of CSS survey, browser compatibility top of the list. We saw the same responses in the MDN developer needs assessment, interoperability between browsers, that comes top. And this is some research conducted at Google, making a designer experience work the same across browsers. That's a top challenge. So kind of why is this happening? Now, it's not because browsers want your life to be hard and people who work on browsers want your life to be hard. Everyone wants to make their browser better. Everyone wants to make the web a better platform for developers. If you speak to anyone who's working on a browser, that's what they care about. Working on their browser, but also just generally making the platform better. So when these features are being selected, if each engine chooses a different set of features to implement, they might all be really cool features that developers want. But if they're not in all of the engines, then the browsers actually get further apart. And we get even more things that look really great, but developers think, well, that's unusable because it's not there in all of the engines. It's not helpful, for example, if one engine gets container queries, another one gets Subgrid, and a third fixes some really annoying Flexbox bugs. Well, that's great, but they've all got separate things. We want these things everywhere. So to try and address this, Google began working with other browsers and industry partners last year to try and fix the things that came up as the top 5 browser compatibility pain points. So that was to do with Flexbox, Grid, Position Sticky, Aspect Ratio, and CSS transforms. Now, this effort was a great success. There was a number of issues and missing features were implemented across Chromium, Gecko, and WebKit. So that was great. We were getting stuff into the hands of developers that was fixed. Lots was done there. And so for 2022, browser vendors and other partners got together again, and this time collaborated together on the decision-making on which features should be included. So there was a robust process, and this resulted in the areas now part of the project we call Interop 2022. So this is an effort to improve the experience of developing for the web in 15 key areas. And it's all happening in the open, so you can follow along with progress on the dashboard. And last week, when I was putting these slides together, it looked a bit like this. And these are the scores for the experimental browsers. So that's Chrome and Edge Dev, Firefox Nightly, and Safari Technology Preview. So you can see that's how it is at the moment. And you can also toggle that to look at stable browsers, so what's actually shipping and available. Now, here are the scores, how the scores are calculated. And if you look at the breakdown of scores, it highlights what I said at the beginning. It's not one browser in the lead all the time. It really depends on which feature it is, which browser is sort of in the lead. And it kind of highlights this fragmentation between browsers. So color spaces and functions, Safari is at 91%, and Firefox and Chrome are lagging right behind at 52 and 51%. Subgrid currently has Chrome way back at 17%. Viewport units, however, get a 100% score for Chrome and Firefox, with Safari at 57%. So it's really spread out across the browsers, who's doing the best in different areas. So where do these scores come from? How are we figuring them out? And where can you look at the data? So these scores come from web platform tests. We've got a web platform test project, which is a set of tests for really all the specifications on the web. Anything that's in a browser really should have a test so that when it's implemented in another browser, we know that it works the same way. And so those tests are being used to create these scores. The browsers pass the test, they get a higher score. So we can start drilling down into any of those areas. And you can see the tests that have been sort of tried out. And you can see here we've got some red and some green on this feature. On the left are the actual test files, the tests that have been run. If you click on any of those, you can see more detail about it and actually, what happened when it was run last. And you can also look at the source of an individual test. A lot of these tests are very, very simple. They're just, checking that a feature actually works. Often it would be a sort of a ref test saying, does this look like that? And if it does, then the browser passes. So that's how browsers are being assessed. So let's take a look at some of the included features. I've made demos and collected resources for these, which you can find on my notice page for this talk, which I'll have a link at the end, so you can explore the demos and try them out. So I already mentioned Compat 2021. And the sort of first set of features are kind of brought over from that project because there were things that still needed a bit of work doing to kind of get them finished, get them properly completed. I mean, if we look at those scores, you can see they're fairly high. Most of them are up in the 90s in terms of passing those tests. So there's some little bits and pieces that need finishing off. So some of the cool things that are now possible due to the focus on these features. We've got the aspect ratio property and the related ability for browsers to map the width and height attribute to the property. This mapping is really useful because it stops those annoying layout shifts as images load in and sort of work out how much space they're going to need to take. So to benefit from the mapping, you should just add a width and height attribute to your image elements on your page. But you can also use this property directly to set up an aspect ratio. Now, where this has been a problem in the past is things like video content, when you're embedding video from YouTube, and so it's being embedded, and basically you have the width flexible because it's a responsive design, and then you want the height to be an aspect ratio of that width, and that was really difficult to do. We were sort of using the padding hack to get around it. But now we've got this property, we can just create boxes that have an aspect ratio by using it. So it looks like this. We say aspect ratio 16:9, and it works exactly as you'd imagine. Great for doing your video content. That's the obvious use case for this. But I think it can also be used really interestingly in creative ways, such as this little demo, which is a figure element with 3 images and a fig caption. So I've given the images a 1:1 aspect ratio. So that means they're always going to be square. I'm then using grid to overlay the fig caption across the 3. And you can see that in DevTools. So the last few fixes for this will just make sure it's really robust and you can rely on it. And then we have Flexbox. Got a bit of a reputation for maybe being a bit buggy, and Compat 2021 fixed some issues that people were running into. And it also added a few features from the box alignment spec that were missing in Flex layouts. So we got the gap property for Flexbox in Safari. We also got the values of start, end, self-start, self-end, left and right, which are really useful if you create content displayed in both left to right and right to left languages. So you have some values of start and end, which are flow relative. And we have start, which is start and end, which is the writing mode of the container, and self-start and self-end, which relate to the writing mode of the subject. So again, really useful for this sort of international content. Another thing that was fixed is sticky positioning. It was causing all sorts of problems for developers not behaving consistently. Things like not being able to make table headers and footers sticky. These issues, they were fixed in Chrome last year in Chrome 91. And people were really excited about what that enabled with tables. Now, a lot of that was enabled by Tables.ng, which resolved 72 tables-related Chromium bugs. And this is part of the Rendering NG project. If you like to get geeky into how browsers work and how rendering works, there's a whole load of posts over on developer.chrome.com digging into how Rendering NG is making things better. So let's look at the new features, the things that we decided to add for Interop 2022, that all of the browser vendors and the other people working on this thought were the things to focus on. So here's the list. Again, this is sort of last week I took this screenshot, and they were the sort of standings, how we're doing. So Cascade Layers. This is an absolutely game-changing feature. It's going to solve a lot of the problems people have had for years with the Cascade. Already landed in Chrome, Firefox and Safari, and that's why all the scores are so high right now. Now, this is the sort of feature you really can't use unless it's everywhere. So hopefully that's something that you're going to start to feel confident to use soon. So you can group your styles into a layer, then manage how the whole layer fits into the cascade rather than individual things. So this is going to make things a lot easier. You're not going to have to manage your entire style sheet in terms of the specificity of things, because you'll be able to group stuff into a layer. It makes it much easier when you're working with a team or when you're bringing in somebody else's CSS, if you're working with a framework, for example. Now, color spaces and functions. Color on the web. If you're doing it a long time, if you recognize that box model hack at the beginning, you might also remember when we only had 216 colors to play with, because these were the only colors that displayed consistently across browsers. Things aren't that bad now, but we are tied to sRGB. But that's changing, and color spaces are coming to the web, new color spaces. And along with them, we've got new color functions. Now, these are really useful, and I like these a lot. I'm glad they're part of Interop 2022, because if you've been using things like SAS, other preprocessors, you've probably been using color functions. as part of the preprocessor to, make things lighter and darker. With these functions, we'll be able to do that in CSS. So I think these are really, really useful. We've got color mix. It takes 2 colors and returns the result of mixing them in a specified color space by a specified amount. And so that looks a bit like this. We've got color mix in the color space. This is LCH. And then, which color we're going to mix it in and which amount, so here's 10%. Here I'm mixing increasing amounts of white into dark blue. At the moment, you need to use Safari with the feature flag enabled in the develop menu to get that to work. Also in Safari is color contrast. This selects from a list of colors the color with the highest contrast to a specified single color. So here I'm changing the background and then picking whether white or black has the most contrast. Really, really useful if you are letting people, do theming, for example, choose the background color. You're not having to sort of make a guess as to what a good foreground color will be for that. So that's a really, really handy function. And so this is that example. Again, you can try that out in Safari. And then we have containment with the contain property. And it gives you a way to tell the browser that some aspects of a box or a particular box on the page, it's completely independent from the rest of the layout. This is useful if you're changing things on your page with JavaScript, for instance, in a single page app. And it just tells the browser, hey, look, this lot does not need to be redrawn. You don't need to, there's no paint needed. That can just stay as it is. So this is very simple, contain layout. The layout is not going to change. Interop 2022 aims to fix some outstanding issues with containment, which is really important because our sort of longed for feature of container queries, which is currently being developed by browsers, it relies on containment to work. Interop 2022 doesn't include container queries, but this is kind of a foundational step. It's important that this is in place. And then we have the dialogue element. It gives us a way to create modal dialogues that web applications always need. It comes with a JavaScript API for opening and closing dialogues, as well as the backdrop pseudo class for styling the backdrop behind the dialogue. It's got pretty good browser support fairly recently. It came into browsers. So there's some sort of final work, again, to tidy up issues to make sure that this, is in browsers and also is really robust, because it's the sort of feature that you want to be able to really rely on as a core piece of your app. Now, this is something from my colleague Adam. He wrote this tutorial and he's showing how to build on top of the element, to design a sort of a really pretty dialogue and thinking about the accessibility and so on. And then there's sort of these big groups of issues. So forms, it's not fixed everything that's terrible about forms, but hopefully it's fixing quite a few things that you might run into that aren't good about forms. Good way to find out what's included is to kind of poke around the web platform tests that are linked for forms to see what's included in there. There's also a long thread for each of these things. You'll find there are threads about which features were actually included. And these were all agreed by all of the different vendors. We also have a lot of stuff around scrolling, because scrolling is problematic a lot of the time on the web. Some of my colleagues created a survey last year about scrolling and found out from developers exactly what was difficult. And you can have a look at that on web.dev. So Interop 2022 aims to fix issues around overscroll behavior and scroll snapping. And now we come to a cause that is dear to my heart because I like talking about grid layout, and this is Subgrid. It's already in Firefox, Safari Technology Preview, and it's under development in Chrome. The work's been done by the Microsoft team. Now, this unlocks a bunch of layout patterns that I don't really have time to dive into today. I'm going to sort of quickly show you them, and you can go and have a look at my demos. So we have a pattern that lets us target the main or full width area using the name. But with Subgrid, because we can inherit the grid down into the grandchildren, we can then place an item into the main area that's inside a full width component. That's definitely a bit of code that's fun to play around with. So you get a pattern that's like this, very common pattern on the web. Made very easy by Subgrid. We can also use it to get around the tricky problem where you can't use -1 to target the end line of a grid if the tracks are created implicitly. If you put the items that create the intrinsic row into a wrapper and use Subgrid on the wrapper, you can essentially make it look like you can get a full height grid item by using Subgrid. I think there's lots and lots of little patterns that Subgrid will make easy, as well as the very obvious, being able to line up things that aren't direct children. Typography and encodings. This area includes tests that are mostly around typography fixes for CJK. That's Chinese, Japanese, and Korean characters. So, for example, within that, we have the IC unit. So if you think about the CH unit that represents the advanced measure of the 0 character in the font used to render it, the IC unit represents the advanced measure of the CJK water ideograph, which enables measurements based on an expected glyph count. So again, this is a sort of a look at the internationalization and the need to make the web better for people all around the world. Viewport units. Developers often have issues with viewport sizing. You probably run into it. If you've got mobile devices where they have different placements of elements like the address bar, and you can end up with things overlapped by bits of browser Chrome and things. There's all sorts of tricky things around this. We're going to have some new units. They're in CSS values and units level 4, which describe the largest, smallest, and the dynamic viewport sizes. So implementing these is included in Interop 2022. And then finally, there's this sort of section called Web Compat, which again includes a bunch of tests that are causing problems on various sites. People are saying, this site is broken because of these issues. So it sort of rounds up a collection of things. We also have a bunch of things which are under investigation. Now, these are places where we know developers are having problems. That's been reported, but we don't have a sort of real answer yet, perhaps because the spec isn't ready, or we don't have enough tests, or it's a bit unclear actually what the solution is. So these are places where, because we've got all these, people from browsers in one place, that can be investigated. Everyone can bring their insights, and then we can figure out what the solution is to these things, and hopefully then actually make them better in the future. So I think that's really interesting, the fact that we're not just fixing the stuff that is already, a known interop issue, but we're looking at those things that are a bit more fuzzy around the edges and using all those people to figure out how best to go forward. So all this is really cool. Each little fix, every one of those tests that passes is one thing that you won't run into. But also, each feature landing cross-browser makes so much more stuff possible. The intersection of these things, what happens when we have subgrid and container queries, for example. That's where I think the interesting stuff is, and where the creativity comes, is once people get all of these things into their hands and start being able to use them well. So, we're halfway through the year. You can follow along with progress. And, there's already some discussion happening about what might be in Interop 2023. There's already a tracking issue. So hopefully this is a project that is going to carry on. We've got some momentum now. By the end of the year, hopefully web development is going to be measurably better, which is exciting. But also we're going to be looking at what else we can do to make it even better again. I think it's a really exciting project. Do follow along, do have a look at the different things that are included. And yeah, we'll see where we get to by the end of the year. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was interesting.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, really interesting. I see that we have a couple of questions in chat, so I think we should proceed with them, right? But again, okay, first the questions. Okay, and the first one, I guess, what future CSS features you are most excited about?
I keep being asked this, but I think container queries is obviously super exciting. As much as anything, because it was something that we thought wasn't going to be possible. Even those of us working on CSS thought for a long time we wouldn't be able to do it. And as someone who was a web developer for a very long time, I'm now mainly a writer, but I needed it, and I think everyone is really excited about that. So I'm very, very looking forward to having that.
Right. Thanks a lot. Talking about the time, Since the world is actively switching to mobile devices, to iPads and phones, and you can basically do your job not even opening the laptop for sometimes. What are the biggest challenges in mobile browsers in CSS for CSS?
I mean, I think things like, you know, the viewport stuff is because obviously mobile browsers have a lot of stuff which is tied to the device itself or to the operating system. And I think that's what a lot of developers struggle with, is that it's not like having a desktop where you can be pretty sure how the shape of it's going to be. So I think, yeah, things like the viewport units and so on, I think will help people a lot. I think that's certainly an area. And also, you know, things like performance, because a lot of the time people aren't on you know, fast connections or have a lot of data and so on. So there's a lot of stuff we can be doing in CSS that helps with that, because if we're able to do stuff in CSS, then we're not loading in more JavaScript to do stuff, you know, things like position sticky and so on. I think that's all, you know, really helpful.
Okay, thank you on that. And I do think that we have only one last question left, but I want to emphasize that please, dear listeners, do not forget to join our web breakout room to chat with Rachel and ask a little more questions. And the last question for now for online. How long does it take to bring a new feature or improvement, for that matter, to production, considering different browser engines?
It really depends on the feature. You know, Grid took like 5 years, more than 5 years. Cascade Layers landed quite quickly. It really does depend on how complex the thing is, not just in terms of the specification, but also in terms of actually implementing that in browsers. And because browsers have quite old technology behind them, ultimately, you know, and that's why we see projects like Rendering NG in Chrome to rewrite that engine to make things possible. So sometimes, you know, like Subgrid, for example, it's slow to come to Chrome. And part of that was because Grid had to be rewritten as part of Rendering NG. And once Grid was rewritten, then Subgrid could be added. And so, you know, the times are, it's getting the spec written, it's getting then obviously the browsers then being able to implement it. And that's different for different things. So, you know, it can seem like things take a very long time. But then also you do get things that just appear. So it's not always obvious what is going to take a very long time.
All right, I think that's really clear to me. I think we ran out for the question for this one, but please do check the breakout rooms with Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for your topic and for joining this conference for this noble cause. It's a great pleasure to hear you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me here. It's been really great. Thank you.